The sinking of the Titanic is one of the deadliest disasters in maritime history, taking the lives of over 1,500 passengers and crew members. Although it was one of the largest and most luxurious ships of its time, the Titanic had several hidden flaws that ultimately led to its tragic demise. In this video, we will discuss 10 hidden factors about the Titanic that you never knew. So stay tuned till the end. No. 1. The Titanic had a fire hazard. Before the Titanic set sail on its fateful journey, there was a fire in one of the coal bunkers on the ship. This caused a lot of smoke and fumes to fill up the ship, which likely affected the crew's vision and made it difficult for them to see the iceberg in time. Although the fire was eventually put out, the damage had already been done. It is believed that the fire may have contributed to the Titanic's downfall, as it weakened the ship's structure and made it more susceptible to breaking apart when it hit the iceberg. This is supported by the fact that the ship broke apart along a seam that ran through one of the coal bunkers where the fire had occurred. The fire was likely caused by spontaneous combustion of coal, which is a common occurrence in ships that transport coal. It is possible that the crew was aware of the fire, but they did not know how serious it was. They tried to keep the fire under control by blowing air into the bunker, but this only made the fire worse. Eventually, they had to abandon the bunker altogether and seal it off from the rest of the ship. The fire was eventually discovered after the Titanic had sunk and the wreck had been raised to the surface. This was done by examining the ship's logs and talking to survivors who had been on board at the time. Number 2, the Titanic had a bad reputation. Despite being one of the most luxurious and advanced ships of its time, the Titanic had a reputation for being unreliable and dangerous. Many people believed that the ship was cursed and that it would eventually sink. These rumors were likely due to a series of unfortunate incidents that had occurred on board the ship prior to its sinking, such as engine failures and collisions with other ships. In addition, the Titanic was involved in a number of near misses with icebergs, before it finally struck the one that sank the ship. Some people believe that these near misses were actually attempts by the ship's captain to steer it towards an iceberg, so that he could collect insurance money for the ship. Others believe that the captain was simply trying to avoid the icebergs because he knew that they were dangerous. However, it is more likely that the captain was simply inexperienced, and that he did not know how to properly navigate the ship. Number 3, the Titanic was not properly maintained. The Titanic was a relatively new ship when it sank, and it had not yet had a chance to develop any major mechanical problems. However, there were a number of small issues that had been ignored or improperly fixed, which likely contributed to the ship's sinking. For example, the ship's hull had a number of small dents and scratches, which had been caused by collisions with other ships and icebergs. These collisions had also caused the ship's rivets to loosen, which allowed water to leak into the ship's hull. In addition, the ship's lifeboats were old and in poor condition, which meant that they would not have been able to save many of the passengers and crew members. Finally, the ship's flares were defective, which meant that the crew could not see the iceberg until it was too late. All of these issues could have been avoided if the ship had been properly maintained, but unfortunately, they were not. 4. The Titanic had a weak hull. The Titanic's hull was made of steel plates that were riveted together. However, the riveting process was not done properly, and this made the hull weaker than it should have been. In addition, the steel plates themselves were of poor quality, and this further reduced the ship's strength. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, its hull was unable to withstand the impact, and this allowed water to flood into the ship. If the hull had been stronger, it is possible that the Titanic would have been able to stay afloat long enough for the passengers and crew members to be rescued. Number 5. The Titanic had a flawed design. The Titanic was designed to be the largest and most luxurious ship of its time. However, its design also had a number of flaws that made it more likely to sink. For example, the ship was too wide for the draft it was given, which meant that it was less stable in the water. In addition, the ship's lifeboats were not properly designed and they would not have been able to save many of the passengers and crew members. Finally, the ship's flares were defective, which meant that the crew could not see the iceberg in time to avoid it. All of these design flaws contributed to the Titanic's sinking, and could have been avoided if the ship had been properly designed. Number 6. The Titanic had a bad captain. The Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, was an experienced sailor, but he made a number of mistakes that led to the ship's sinking. For example, he did not properly assess the risk of icebergs in the area. and he did not take the necessary precautions to avoid them. He also did not use the ship's lifeboats properly, and he did not sound the alarm when the ship hit the iceberg. Finally, he did not have a clear plan for evacuating the ship, and this led to confusion and panic among the passengers and crew members. All of these mistakes contributed to the loss of many lives and could have been avoided if the captain had been more competent. 7. The Titanic had a false sense of security. The Titanic was considered to be the most unsinkable ship of its time, and this gave the passengers and crew members a false sense of security. They believed that the ship was safe and that they had nothing to worry about, even though it was traveling through an area known for icebergs. This sense of security led to a lack of preparation for a potential sinking, as many people did not pack life jackets or other survival gear. In addition, the ship's lifeboats were not properly designed, and they would not have been able to save many of the passengers and crew members. Finally, the ship's flares were defective, which meant that the crew could not see the iceberg in time to avoid it. All of these factors combined to create a perfect storm that led to the Titanic's downfall. Number 8. The Titanic was too heavy. The Titanic was designed to be the largest and most luxurious ship of its time. However, its size and weight also made it more likely to sink. The ship was carrying a full load of passengers and cargo, which made it top-heavy. In addition, the ship's lifeboats were not properly designed, and they would not have been able to save many of the passengers and crew members. Finally, the ship's flares were defective, which meant that the crew could not see the iceberg in time to avoid it. All of these factors combined to make the Titanic more likely to sink than it needed to be. 9. The Titanic hit an uncharted iceberg. The Titanic hit an iceberg that was not on any of the ship's charts, which meant that the crew had no way of knowing that it was there. This made it impossible for the crew to avoid the iceberg, and it contributed to the ship's sinking. The iceberg was located in an area that was known to be dangerous, but it had not been charted because it was too small to be of any real concern. However, when the Titanic hit the iceberg, it became clear that even small icebergs can be deadly. Number 10. The Titanic did not have enough lifeboats. The Titanic had a total of 20 lifeboats, but only enough lifeboat space for about 1,177 people. This meant that many passengers and crew members would not have been able to evacuate the ship safely. In addition, the lifeboats were not properly designed, and they would not have been able to save many of the people on board. If the Titanic had had enough lifeboats, and if they were properly designed, it is possible that many more people would have survived the sinking. As we've seen, there were many factors that contributed to the Titanic's downfall. From its faulty design to its bad captain, there were many things that could have been avoided if the proper precautions had been taken. The sinking of the Titanic was a tragedy that resulted in the loss of many lives. But by learning from the mistakes that were made, we can ensure that such a disaster never happens again. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more videos like this.